Welcome back to our series on the tumultuous life of King George III. In this episode, we'll explore how he made a lot of people really mad, from the American colonists to his own family and ministers. The road ahead is filled with political turmoil, family betrayals, and the unravelling of a once mighty monarch. Great Britain's win gave American colonists more land to use, but part of this grand empire, they wanted even more. When George III issued the Proclamation of 1763, limiting settlers and protecting Native American land, the colonists flipped out. They felt betrayed, and trouble was brewing for George III. Lord Bute was a close friend of George for a very long time, but the government troubles took a toll on their relationship. In 1763, Bute resigned. Despite George's mother trying to patch things up, it didn't work. Out of sight, Lord Bute faded away, making the king the blame for many decisions Bute had made. This wasn't the last time a prime minister messed things up for him. To recover lost money and deal with conflicts in the US, George III and the next prime minister, George Grenville, introduced the 1765 Stamp Act. It caused a huge uproar and controversy. The act put taxes on printed materials in the colonies, seen as a personal attack. The colonies were furious, and once again the king was in trouble. After lots of conflict, George III reluctantly agreed to repeal the Stamp Act. While the colonies celebrated, even putting up a statue of him in New York City, it would come back to haunt him. George did well in one aspect of his reign, having kids. After marrying Charlotte, they had a whopping 15 children, almost all surviving to adulthood. It was extraordinary for royals at that time, and despite a shaky start, George III and Charlotte made things work. They genuinely loved each other and had produced heirs. Yet the stresses of his reign were taking a toll on George. In 1765, King George faced a mysterious mental disorder. His mother and her allies closely watched over the sick king, hiding the full extent of his illness from his wife, poor Queen Charlotte. The worried queen was often found crying throughout the palace. Suddenly he recovered out of nowhere. Things returned to normal, but for George, normal meant tension, strife, and drama. Even though he had a happy family at home, George's extended family was far from joyful. George was a pretty serious guy, religious, and unlike his predecessors, he didn't have mistresses. However, his brothers followed family traditions of affairs and secret marriages that the king disapproved of. George tried to pass a law preventing royal family members from marrying without the king's approval. It was another failed attempt to hold power that only undermined confidence in the king. As things spiraled out of control, George still trusted the parliamentary government, and here's where it backfired. Tensions rose in the colonies, and subjects were tired of paying taxes without representation. In a big mistake, George said, "Forget about everything, except the duty on tea." Well, maybe not those exact words, but it really angered the colonists. British people don't joke about tea. The British saw the Boston tea protests and tea destruction as vicious and unlawful. Before, tensions mostly existed in the colonies, but now it was mutual. George's role painted him as a tyrant, and the colonies were ready to revolt. You might know the next part. 13 colonies were fed up with Britain and fought back. In July 1776, they declared independence, blaming George for abandoning governance in America. The American Revolutionary War began, and chances are you know how it went for George. George III tried to rally his inexperienced ministers for a civil conflict, but then France joined, making things worse. While the colonies had allies worldwide, Britain only had loyalists. Everything was falling apart before George's eyes, and it was about to get much worse. George's ministers begged to quit the impossible job that they faced. There was a fear that the colonies' allies might invade England. With little power left, George gathered 7,000 men to cross the Atlantic, but it was too little, too late. After many losses, George had no choice but to accept defeat. It tarnished his entire legacy, but first he had to deal with the aftermath. After losing America, the British Parliament was in chaos. It went through many prime ministers until George put his foot down. Through manoeuvring, he got an ally, William Pitt the Younger, as PM. Pitt was the youngest Prime Minister of Great Britain at just 24. Despite some minor parliamentary issues, George finally had one of his own where he wanted him. Considering the storm ahead, he would need him. Surprisingly, the people of Great Britain liked the combo of Pitt and George. Pitt was energetic and subjects appreciated him as a family man. There was a more tragic reason for their warmth. King and Queen lost two sons in 1782 and 1783. Prince Alfred was one and Prince Octavius three. The loss weighed heavily on George, adding to his fragile health, and soon everything fell apart. In the summer of 1788, King George had another breakdown, and this time it was much worse. He spent much of that period in a manic state, locking his wife and daughters in a room and talking for hours. They convinced him to go to Cheltenham Spa to recuperate, but sadly it didn't help. When he returned home, things got even worse. By November 1788, George's mental state worsened. He talked for hours, foaming at the mouth and dehydrated. Sometimes repeating himself, he got more creative and used a wider vocabulary in other episodes. There was even a tale of him introducing himself to a tree, thinking it was the King of Prussia. His family struggled to keep it a secret, but someone within their ranks was plotting. One doctor visited the king without speaking to Queen Charlotte, alerting her to a devastating truth. Someone was trying to cut her off from her husband. Tragically, her eldest son, the Prince of Wales, was behind it. He suspected Charlotte wanted the throne, while she feared he might have his father declared insane for his accession. While the power struggle unfolded, doctors struggled to help the king. As we conclude this chapter on King George III, the man who faced immense opposition, stay tuned for the next part of his tragic journey. Join me in part 3 to delve into the aftermath of George's failed efforts, his surprising successes, and the ongoing challenges that ultimately led to his heartbreaking breakdown. Subscribe, like, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next installment of this captivating historical saga. In the upcoming Part 3 episode, we'll unravel the disturbing methods used to treat King George III's mental health, the power struggles within Parliament, and the heart-wrenching losses that shattered the King's world. From mysterious illnesses to family betrayals, this chapter exposes the depths of sorrow that marked George's tragic reign. Stay tuned for the next installment in the sorrowful tale of King George III.